Hello students, welcome to Digital Learning. I am Shubha Hiremat, Assistant Professor of English, Government First Grade College and PG Center, Harvard. In this session, we will discuss the pre-independence period, poetry. In the previous session, we have already discussed the literary background of pre-independence period in Indian English literature and how poetry has become a major dominant genre in Indian English literature. And the pre-independence period, for the ease of understanding, has divided into two phases. The first phase, that is the from 1850s to 1900, it is often called as imitative period, and the next phase in the pre-independent period is from 1900 to 1947. So this second phase is assimilative period, when Indian poets are still romantic tried to assimilate romanticism of early 19th century British poets, and they were also called as neo-romantics because they are conscious of Indian Renaissance, and they mixed the nationalism and political changes in their poetry, which ultimately led to the attainment of political freedom in 1947. So their poems are not just based on Indian mythology and historical aspects, but they were filled with patriotism, nationalism, and Indian sensibility was very well expressed in their poetry. So in the poetry of second phase, many pre-independent Indian English poets hailed from Bengal. Bengal, that is Calcutta, was the center for producing Indian English poetry during pre-independence period, and most of them were Bengalis. The history of Indo-Anglian poetry is mainly development from neo-romanticism to mysticism and to neo-modernism. From Henry Derozio to Sarojini Naidu, the trend was of romanticism. Toru Dutt was the first neo-romantic poet. She glorifies India's cultural heritage in her poems. The phase Indo-Anglian romanticism ended with poetry of Sarojini Naidu. The major poets during this period, for example, Shri Aurobindo, whose poetry was full of mysticism. His poetry is lyrical, narrative, and philosophical, and also of Rabindranath Tagore's poems like Gitanjali. They are full of spiritualism and mysticism. There is mantric quality and very close to Vedanta in the poems of Shri Aurobindo. In his poems, we find a fusion of personal vision and spiritual personality of India. Hence, the poets of in the beginning explored Indian themes. The major themes in the writing of Toru Dutt, Rabindranath Tagore, Harindranath Chattopadhyay, Sarojini Naidu, in all their poems we find Indianness, which is the major theme. And for example, in the poem of Toru Dutt, that is Our Casuarina Tree, we find there is Indianness, and also Tagore, Aurobindo, Naidu also helped to build Indian English poetry on Indian myth, legend, and history. Since then, Indian poetry has been Indian first and everything later. The changes in national climate have been expressed in their poetry. The poetry proved the glorious voice of the essential humanity and universality. Love, nature, life, nationalism, patriotism, motherland, man, myth, legends, fine art, and beauty are some of the major themes in this poetry. They are the poems of introspective and metaphysical qualities. And of course, we find the influence of English Romantics, Victorians, and Decadents, but their poetry was the best voice of the contemporary Indian time spirit. The Dutt family album, which was published in 1870, is the first notable poetry work of this period. It is the only instance of family anthology in Indian English poetry. This is a collection of 187 poems by three Dutt brothers, namely Govind Chandra Dutt, Har Chandra Dutt, and Grish Chandra Dutt, and also their cousin. These poets can hardly with India. They treat their Indian material as something poetically serviceable. Their major subjects are Christian sentiment, nature, and Indian history and legend. Ram Sharma wrote occasional verse satires, narratives, lyrics on various themes and mystical verse. Hindu yogic experience was expressed through conventional Western myth and frame. Toru Dutt was brought up Indian English poetry from imitation to authenticity. Toru Dutt was born in a Hindu family but was baptized with family members in 1862. Reading and music were her hobbies. She learned English in France and England. She sailed for Europe in 1869 and returned to India in 1873. She died at the age of 21 when her talent was maturing. There are two collections of poems on her name, out of which one appeared in her own lifetime. However, it was not in the nature of original work. It was a sheaf gleaned in French fields, which comprised 165 lyrics by about 100 French poets. These lyrics are translated by her. To Edmund Ghose, the volume is a wonderful mixture of strength and weakness. We find Keatsian progress in the last 2 years of her life in her poetry, and it is revealed in her posthumous publication, Ancient Ballads and Legends of Hindustan. The themes of these poems indicate that Toru Dutt is the first Indian poet who used Indian myth and legend extensively. Though she was brought up in Christian living or in a half anglicized environment, she gives the treatment of instinctive and spiritual understanding of the legends. In her poems like Our Casuarina Tree, Sita, The Lotus, we find poetic technique which shows a sure grasp more than poetic mood. Her diction is naturally of the Victorian Romantic school, and from ballad, blank verse, and sonnet, her prosodic skills are used. Toru Dutt's poetry is virtually free from imitation. The next notable poet of pre-independent Indian English poetry is Romesh Chandra Dutt. We have already discussed his works in the prose and even in poetry. And here, the Ramchandra Dutt, who was both Bengali and English, he wrote in bilingual. His all English verses are translations that aim to produce condensed version of the great epics. Lays of Ancient India is a collection of verse uh, and he has preserved the musical movement of the original in English translations, for which he employed a shloka meter and reduced the complexity of these Hindu classics. But the use of this shloka meter evaporated the spirit of the original. However, they have been remained as the best introduction in English to our great national epics. Very accurately, he has delineated basic human motives and emotions in his poems. Manmohan Ghosh was educated in England. He was sent to England at 10. He is a classic example which shows an exiled heart, sense of alienation, and unhappy childhood and adolescence. Manmohan Ghosh published Premavira, a collection of verse in 1890, Love Songs and Elegies in 1898, and Song of Love and Death in 1926. His poems like Immortal Eve and Mysteries are his poetic sequels. George Sampson rightly says, Manmohan is the best remarkable of Indian poets who wrote in English. He is a poet as if trained in classic tradition. Manmohan Ghosh's brother, Shri Aurobindo, had also same kind of upbringing. He had passed civil service examination and was a master of many languages like Greek, Latin, French, English, German, Italian, Sanskrit, and Bengali. In due course, he became Mahapurusha, a Mahayogi. He founded the Center of Yoga at Pondicherry. Shri Aurobindo is well known as a poet and critic of life and letters, and he also actively participated in India's freedom struggle, for which he was also imprisoned. And his collected poems and plays is the best known. Shri Aurobindo has a parallel record of poetic achievements as a translator and narrative poet, as a metrical and verbal craftsman, as a lyricist and dramatist, and as a futurist poet. Urvashi and Love and Death are his beautifully articulated narrative poems. Bachi Prabhu is a first-rate action poem. Perseus the Deliverer is a blank verse drama. Thought the Paraclete and The Rose of God are the finest mystical poems in the language. His long poem, Ahana and Ilian, are the best example of classical qualities meters. And as we know, Savitri has created a new kind of epic poetry. He has been aptly called as Milton of India. Equally important poet is Rabindranath Tagore, who is known for his work, that is Gitanjali, and won Nobel Prize in the year 1913. Tagore was another prominent contemporary poet, and Mahatma Gandhi rightly called him as the Great Sentinel. He touched and enriched modern Indian life in many ways. He was poet, dramatist, novelist, short story writer, composer, painter, thinker, educationist, nationalist, and internationalist also. He, as a bilingual poet, occupied the significant place in Indo-Anglian poetry. The Child and a few other poems are written in English. His Gitanjali, which compelled a worldwide attention and for which he won Nobel Prize, is having the spirituality as major theme. Tagore wrote The Gardener, Stray Birds, Lover's Gift and Crossing, The Fugitive, and many other poems. W.B. Yeats and Ezra Pound were the admirers of Tagore's poetry. He was of international acclaim. Tagore's verse in English had lyrical quality, it had rhythm of free verse. He dealt with simplicity, seriousness, and passion, and Tagore used colloquial idiom and archaic vocabulary like thee and thou. Sarojini Naidu started her career as a poet, but later she became prominent politician of Gandhian era. She had recognition in England much earlier. Her first volume of poetry, The Golden Threshold, was followed by The Bird of Time, The Broken Wing. Her collected poems appeared in The Sceptred Flute, a small collection of lyrics written in 1927, Father of the Dawn was published posthumously in 1961. Her lyrics are strongly influenced by British Romanticism and Persian and Urdu poets. In all four volumes of Sarojini Naidu, witness her unerring sense of beauty and melody. Her poems like Bangle Sellers, Palanquin Bearers, many other poems present a feast of delight to the reader. As a lyricist, she always spoke in her private voice and never bothered to express the burning problems of her day. But she is the first rank artist having the strength of perfect rhythm with which she can be close to Toru Dutt, Tagore, and Aurobindo. Though she appears hopelessly outdated by the standards of modern poetic taste, she is historically significant and intrinsically important poet of Indian English literature. Rabindranath Chattopadhyay, born in 1898, is also a well-known poet. He was written some brilliant pieces of poetry. Many of his poems are marked a devotional note and his belief in Marxist ideology. He has remained as an idealist and seeker of spiritual truth. He published numerous volumes of verse like The Feast of Youth, Virgins and Vineyards, The Magic Tree, Poems and Plays, Spring in Winter, and many other poems. Chattopadhyay's better poems have been engulfed in a mass of middling, and his themes are the staple of all romantic poetry, like nostalgia, melancholy, passion for beauty, the changing moods of love, idealism, and humanitarian. Thus, in the first quarter of the 20th century, many poets had a heavy influence of Romantic and Victorian fashion. The poets like Swami Vivekananda, Kabardar, Nismachan, and many Acharya, like many poets, who also tried to explore through their poems Indian or Oriental thought and legend. N.W. Pai produced a romance blank verse, The Angel of Misfortune. Anand Acharya rendered his own prose poems like Tagore, but there were some poets who responded the new trend, that is Georgian period in English literature. Ravi Dutt, Joseph Fernando, Sheshadri, Chettur, all these poets reveal Georgian love of the colloquial idiom and simple handling of poetical themes. Thus, the first and second phase of pre-romantic, pre-independent poetry, we find it has moved from imitative to assimilative stage, and the Indian English literature came into existence. India's rediscovery of her identity became vigorous. The Indian poets, Indian English literature began to progress, though by absorbing, learning, and imitating from the West. With this, I will conclude the session, and in the next session, we will discuss the literary background and development of novel in pre-independence Indian English literature. Thank you.